Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
Episode 126, Aunt Thally. Caroline Grills was an Australian serial killer who poisoned her victims. She murdered well-off members of her extended family to maintain her lifestyle, and it was discovered that she actually poisoned them with thallium, which was a rat poison found in everyday households at that time. She first became a murder suspect in 1947. Caroline Grills was born Caroline Mickelson in Balmain, New South Wales on the 19th of February 1890. She was the daughter of George Mickelson and Mary Julia Pryor. Her father George's name was anglicised. His name was Gertie Mickelson, and he was born in Norway in June 1857. Her mother Mary was born in Portugal in 1865, which is where they had their first child. By 1880, they'd emigrated to Sydney. All up, they had 6 children, and Caroline was the third born of the family. Her mother died before 1900, with the youngest child being only 2. On the 22nd of April 1908, Caroline married Richard William Grills at the District Registrar's office in Balmain South. Richard was a labourer. 2 of their boys died tragically. One of their children, William, in 1940, was killed only at the age of 20. They were living at Maroubra at the time, and he was fatally injured when his motorcycle ran into a stray cow in Canal Road, St Peters. A military ambulance was passing at the time and took him to Marrickville Hospital, where he was found to be dead. And another son, Harold, died of typhoid fever, and the article outlining his death says, Beach Inspector's death. 2 days after bringing in the body of a dead surfer at Maroubra, Harold Grills, 28, widely known as the Randwick Council Beach Inspector, developed typhoid fever and died 10 weeks later in hospital. Dr. Beaumont of Maroubra said that immediately after Grills came to me, I ordered him to bed. 2 days later, I saw him again. His temperature was then 104, and I ordered his removal to the Coast Hospital. When I attended him, he may have been suffering from typhoid fever, pneumonia, or influenza. Asked whether Grills could have contracted typhoid fever by handling a dead body, Dr. Beaumont said it is quite possible. On the other hand, he may have contracted typhoid fever from contamination with refuse washed into Maroubra Beach from the adjacent sewer. In 1913, Caroline and Richard were living at Coaldale, New South Wales. Richard later found work in real estate, allowing them to find a better home to rent in Gladesville. Sydney in the years after World War II was suffering from a housing shortage and a rat plague. In 1947, Caroline Grills looked for a way of keeping her house rat-free and was advised by the council to buy a commercially available rat poison containing the heavy metal thallium. Caroline's stepmother, Christina, died in November 1947. No one suspected foul play. Known by Aunt Carrie by her extensive family, she was a short, dumpy woman who wore thick-rimmed glasses. She frequently visited her in-laws and friends, making tea, cakes and biscuits for them. However, after the death of her stepmother, there were also deaths of 3 other family members, relatives by marriage, Angelina Thomas and John Lundberg, and her sister-in-law, Mary Ann Mickelson. Emboldened by the first murder of a stepmother, Grills began giving thallium-laced tea and goodies to Angelina Thomas, her husband's sister-in-law, who Caroline knew had left a house in Leura to Richard, her husband, in her will. And Angelina Thomas died in January 1948. Again, nobody thought it unusual that 84-year-old Angelina Thomas should die suddenly. Caroline Grills' third victim was John Lundberg. He was a robust 60-year-old former seaman who holidayed with Caroline and Richard in Woy Woy in 1948, only to return home with a mysterious illness that claimed his life. Grills had nothing to gain from his death, so it seems that this time it was for the thrill. Mary Ann Mickelson was the next and final victim to die in February 1949. Again, Grills had nothing to gain financially from her murder. Mary Ann Mickelson was unwell. Her hair had fallen out. She suffered nervous disorders, blindness, and was bedridden. She was thankful for the attentions of her sister-in-law, the jolly bespectacled granny Carrie Grills, who brought her tea and baked her cakes and biscuits. But the 60-year-old Mickelson's undiagnosed illness worsened. Despite Grills's smiling intentions, on the 15th of February 1949, Marianne Mickelson finally succumbed to her mystery ailment. Since nobody knew what disease those symptoms pointed to, Mickelson was buried without fuss. She then turned her attention to Eveline Lundberg, the widow of John Lundberg, who she visited frequently, bringing baked goodies and tea. She also offered it to Lundberg's daughter, Christina Downey, and her husband, John Downey. All soon became ill, and Eveline went blind and lost her hair. In 1952, after Newtown housewife Yvonne Fletcher was convicted of poisoning her husbands with thallium, Lundberg's family became suspicious. One day, John Lundberg noticed that Caroline Grills was putting something in his mother-in-law's tea. He spied her taking something from her pocket and dropping it into the tea. Under the pretense of topping it up, he slipped into the kitchen, poured the tea into a jar before giving Eveline a fresh brew. He later had the suspect tea tested, and it was found to contain thallium. At the time, thallium was easy to buy over the counter in New South Wales. The general symptoms of thallium poisoning were loss of hair, nervous disorders, progressive blindness, loss of speech, and eventual death. In addition, both Downey and Lundberg suffered symptoms for some time, recovering only when Mrs. Grills did not visit. John, Christina, and Eveline were all found with thallium in their system. As a result, a police investigation ensued, and they exhumed the bodies of the 4 other family members and also discovered traces of thallium. Officers found traces of thallium in the pocket of the dress that Caroline had been wearing. From March 1952 until the arrest of Grills, there'd been 46 cases of reported thallium poisoning involving 10 deaths in Australia. So the police started putting a case against Carrie, and they believed that Carrie's motive was largely inheritance money. Further investigation led police to charge Grills with 4 murders and 1 attempted murder, and when Detective Sergeant Don Ferguson arrested her, Aunt Carrie was quite cool in her reply and said, "Fancy that." All the victims, with the exception of a friend of her mother, were in-laws. Police speculated that her poisoning spree began in 1947 with the murder of her stepmother, and in May 1953 she was arrested and charged with 4 counts of murder and 3 of attempted murder. While the police believed that a strong circumstantial case existed to substantiate murder, they only proceeded with the original charge of attempting to murder Mrs. Lundberg, as they believed the evidence was stronger and more direct. And the articles at the time, the first one was on the 13th of May 1953, and it says remanded on poisoning charges. In Sydney, Mrs. Caroline Grills of Gladesville appeared in the Central Court today, charged with attempting to murder 2 women with thallium poison. Mrs. Grills pled not guilty. Mrs. Grills was charged with administering thallium poison to Eveline Lundberg and Christine Downey. Mr. Rowley said his client bore an excellent character and was the wife of a well-known city businessman. She desires to clear herself of this charge, of which she says she is entirely innocent. And an article on the 18th of October 1953, kindly old woman used diabolic inhuman murder weapon. 12 jurors took only 12 minutes to convict a kindly old woman of a charge of poisoning by thallium. A judge took only a few seconds to speak her death sentence. A brother and his blinded sister for over 60 years, beloved members of a close-knit family, sat next to each other in the Sydney Central Criminal Court. They heard themselves referred to as the favourite relation of the other, yet made no sign of recognition, gave no salute, showed not the slightest awareness of existence of each other. A family whose close bonds, since before the turn of the century, have been a thing at which to marvel, was torn asunder. The couple at arm's length was Richard William Grills, a state agent, and blinded but unbowed and bravely smiling 67-year-old Eveline Lundberg, victim of at least 3 attacks since 1951 of thallium poisoning. Mr. Grills and Mrs. Lundberg were on opposite camps at the trial of plump, greying Mrs. Caroline Grills, a 63-year-old ride woman, on a charge of having administered thallium poisoning to Mrs. Lundberg, her sister-in-law, on the 20th of April with intent to murder. Married over 46 years ago to Mrs. Grills, then 17, affable, bespectacled Mr. Grills had pictured his wife as a kindly, lovable soul possessed of all maternal and matronly virtues. "My wife is just a kindly housewife, and I'm sure she does not yet realise the seriousness of this matter," Grills later told the Truth. Mrs. Grills was stated to have been introduced to the use of thallium as a rat poison by a city council officer. The Crown alleged that since 1947 she has dosed up to 6 of her relatives by marriage with a colourless, odourless and tasteless concoction, causing at least 3 deaths, besides untold suffering, blindness, baldness and mental disorder. Grills professed her innocence, claiming that the police had pressured her relations to convict her and that she helped them to live, not to kill. Her behaviour in court, marked by outbursts of laughter, reinforced ideas that she was a malevolent killer. Giving evidence from the witness box today, Mrs. Grills said that she'd been told by police that an analyst found thallium in the pocket of her dress, and she said she did not know what she meant when she said, "That's funny, I did not think he would." She admitted that the police had taken possession of 2 bottles containing thalrat from a cupboard in her home. Mr. Rooney then questioned Mrs. Grills about the thallium stains on her dress, and he asked her if anyone said anything about the dress having stains on it, and Mrs. Grills replied no. And then Mr. Rooney asked, "Then why did you tell him about the goldfish and Jack Downey and the pocket of your brown dress? What made you think that there might be thallium in the pocket?" And Mrs. Grills said, "I thought he might have put it there." His Honour said, "But at this stage you did not know thallium had been found in the pocket. Why then did you suggest to Sergeant Ferguson that Downey might have poured it into the pocket of your dress?" And Mrs. Grills said, "Well, I have been accused of other things before." She said Ferguson had accused her of things she did not do, and she thought that he might be trying to catch her. And His Honour said, "So in other words, you thought that thallium might be found in the pocket?" Mrs. Grills said yes. She said she did not know that she said, "That's funny, I did not know he would," when the analyst found thallium in the pocket. William Grills, the husband of Caroline Grills, said he and his wife were very fond of his sister, Mrs. Eva Lundberg. His wife had never been hungry for money and had dissuaded him from taking action to recover damages after the unusual deaths of her 2 sons. Mrs. Grills said that after her trip to Western Australia, Mrs. Lundberg's mental condition became rather erratic, and one day she remarked during a conversation on poisoning, "My children are trying to poison me." Mr. Hidden said that there was a complete absence of motive. Referring to Downey's evidence about seeing Mrs. Grills pick up 2 cups of water, he said, "What does he do? He follows her to the window. It is he who made the story up. He is the most wicked man ever to come to a court of law. If the story was not made up, he let a cowardly and dastardly act be perpetrated when in 10 steps he could have stopped it." Mr. Rooney said there was a substantial motive for the killing of Christina Mickelson, which was the gain of a house. Mrs. Grills benefited indirectly in the case of Angeline Thomas because her husband got the property. Mr. Rooney said the defence had looked into classical cases for poisoning for hatred or revenge, but added, "What about poisoning for fun, the kick of it, or for the hell of it?" He said Mr. Hidden had tried to suggest Crown witnesses were liars, perjurers and framers conspiring to frame an innocent woman, but suspicion fell on Mrs. Grills by a process of elimination of other members of her household. Her counsel described Mrs. Grills as a kindly old housewife to whom people always looked for help when in trouble, and who had done a great deal of good and never went empty-handed when visiting people. However, the Crown prosecutor addressed the jury and said that Mrs. Grills was a practised habitual poisoner who got a psychological thrill and enjoyment from watching the effects on her victims, and the sense of control as she alone knew the cause of the victim's suffering. Prosecutors argued that her first murders were for financial gain. Mr. Justice Brereton said thallium was a diabolical, inhuman and cowardly weapon which destroyed its victims' faculties. It led to blindness and possible death. Use of poison displayed no particular smartness or cleverness. It was as easy to administer poison to a blind woman as it was to steal pennies from a blind man, he said. 12 minutes after retiring the jury, he found Mrs. Grills guilty and instantly quelled oohs and ahs from women who outnumbered men by 2 to 1 in the packed court. So when the judge handed down the death sentence, he said, Under the guise of friendship and loving kindness, but with apparent motiveless malignity, you administered poison to Mrs. Lundberg, condemning her to at least a life of blindness and possible death. So sudden was the jury's return that Mr. Grills was outside on the lawn of the courthouse when the verdict was given. An absentee also was Mrs. Lundberg. Leaning heavily on the dock, hands wide apart, Mrs. Grills grimaced and blinked at the verdict, then resumed the air of composure which had featured her demeanour throughout the trial. Caroline appealed the decision, but it was dismissed by the Court of Criminal Appeal in April 1954, but her sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. She was admitted to the State Reformatory for Women, where she spent the next 6.5 years. Caroline's husband Richard supported her throughout the trial. He yelled out "Carrie" as she was being led away. Soon afterwards, thallium was banned from sale. She was affectionately known as Aunt Thally to other inmates of Sydney's Long Bay Prison and acted as a maternal figure to the other inmates. On the 6th of October 1960, she was rushed to Prince Henry Hospital at Randwick, where she died from peritonitis, a ruptured ulcer, at the age of 72. Her husband died 3 years after her, and her surviving children, the first was Thomas John Grills, who was born in Sydney in 1907. He married Beatrice Mitchell in Bankstown on the 29th of January 1931. He was a carpenter and he died in August 1978 at the age of 62. They had 2 sons that I'm aware of, Thomas Jr. and George Alfred. The second son was Richard Albert Grills, who was born on the 21st of September 1909 at Woonona in New South Wales. In 1937 he was a clerk living at Stanmore. He married Elfrida Violet May Putland in Randwick in 1942. He enlisted in World War II in 1943 and was discharged in 1945. In 1948 he began to work in his father's real estate business, and he died in Ballina, New South Wales on the 27th of November 1984 at the age of 75. And the third surviving child was George Grills, who was born in 1913 at Woonona. In 1923 he was working as a packer and living with his parents, and in 1958 he was a lawn mowing contractor. He married Irene McMartin on the 10th of April 1937 in Sydney, and he died in Cairns, Queensland in August 1980 at the age of 67. So it seems after the incarceration of their mother that they moved on with their lives. But what a sensational story for the time, and the fact that it actually took thallium, the rat poison, off the shelves completely after this murder case.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.